Hello and welcome to No Veto Video. I'm Carson.
And I'm Katherine, and it's a pleasure to have you guys along with us on our review of The Big Short. Released in 2015, it was directed by Adam McKay and starring Christian Bale, Ryan Gosling, Steve Carell, Brad Pitt, and had a nice couple of side turns by lots of character actors that we enjoy and by some world-renowned economists.
The Big Short is to Wall Street what Moneyball was to the baseball world. Dr. Michael Burry, as well as a few other people, noticed fairly early on that there were problems with the way banks were running mortgages and, to some extent, a few other investments, mostly dependent on mortgages, and sought to either do something about it for moral grounds or sought to make a profit off of it.
So I picked this video and picked this movie for us to watch. We had missed it in the theater. It was something that was sort of hard to get our heads wrapped around. A sort of global financial crisis comedy is how it was marketed and sold, which seemed interesting, but also was like, I don't know that I'm ready to really laugh at that. So when I saw it show up on Netflix, I thought, well, what's the harm? As I started to think about how to respond to the movie, we have to acknowledge that this story takes place in a way that can't be separated from all of our experiences of the banking crisis and of the financial meltdown. And in the ways in which, in a lot of regards, the stories of real people are not the concern of this film. Just sort of wondering how are you sitting with the way in which it's connected to the real world and to things that are still sort of reverberating out even to this day, but also didn't seem to be very much the interest of the storytellers.
There were a number of things that I appreciated about this movie. Completely unrelated to the plot or the storyline, it had a really good soundtrack. And the soundtrack was time period appropriate, which is not unusual in movies, but I take special note when they actually get that right. Another thing I appreciated was, in many movies based on true events, they change details and it's hard to tell what's true and what they edited just to make a good story. They, for many reasons, broke the fourth wall in this movie, and a couple of times they did that to explicitly point out where they changed a detail and what the truth really was. So you're not left confused as to how much of this was actual events. And in a movie with problems that led to a massive crisis, if you're looking to it to tell ways to avoid this in the future, you need the actual details.
What's interesting though is that even when they broke the fourth wall and said this is not how it happened, they went on and played the scene in the fictional way, the better storytelling way. And for me, I found that didn't detract from my enjoyment of the story that they were telling. I didn't enjoy large sections of the story that they were telling, but I could appreciate the way that they were stitching the narrative together. And even knowing, even when having a character stop, face the camera, say, this is not how it happened in this other way, and then go right back into the scene to continue to play it the way that it didn't happen, was actually really, it was a nice approach, but it also didn't pull me out of the narrative in the way that one would expect someone breaking the fourth wall to do that.
They also had put in a number of quotes. It opens, actually, with a quote from Mark Twain, but there were a number of quotes that were from notable people who actually had something relevant to say about what was going on in the movie long before the events of the movie took place. And I thought that was a good historical grounding. History is said to repeat itself, and it clearly appears that way. The director did a good job with that.
Yeah. And again, some of the interesting ways, so you have a series of, there are different vignettes involving sort of three major groups of people who all, for various reasons together, understood the ways in which the system was about to explode and they all sort of, as you said, were doing different things around it. But they're never sort of forced together into one room. Even the one time when some of them are at the same place at the same time, there's just sort of a passing, like, near trains or ships in the night. But they don't ever meet. And there's a part of me that was like, oh, I kind of want them all to get together and, like, swoop in and save the day. But I also was like, it's not that kind of story. It's not the kind of story where everybody pulls together and everybody, marshals their, common resources against a, foe. It's just not that kind of story. And the fact that they resisted what might have been their own urge to do that was...
And a number of the characters would have absolutely hated some of the others. Their personalities were just so different that there is no way they would have got along. And motivations were so different that it would have been nearly impossible for them to work together in some cases.
Do you want to talk about some of the performances that you liked?
Almost all of the performances were really good. I can't think of a bad line of dialogue, or at least a bad presentation of it. The directing was really good. Overall, this movie really came together.
So we're coming to understand that Adam McKay likes to render Christian Bale unrecognizable. So if that's your thing, to know that he's cast him as Dick Cheney in his next film might interest some of you. For me, it is interesting to see someone as charismatic as Christian Bale sort of disappear into someone who, on the spectrum, has sort of spectrum-y elements. Definitely is not able to marshal any of that sort of natural charisma that I feel like the actor himself has.
I think either the director or the writer also felt that maybe they would lose the audience in portions of it, so they would have famous actors and actresses come on and explain a concept, or in one case, a internationally renowned chef would come on and explain the concept and relate it to a fish market.
I mean, I get that, but I also think, like, the first one is a very famous actress in a bubble bath, and it's like, okay. Like, some of the impulses for this storyteller was very similar impulses to the people being portrayed, which is to say that sexism doesn't bother them at all. That gun violence doesn't seem to bother them at all. That racism doesn't bother them at all. In fact, even some of the main characters are happy to use racism and overt, explicit, racist, conversational tools if it means that they can make more money. And that's really, I think, knowing what all of us are coming to know as, we progress as a society, my hope is that there's a way that we can say, like, really? Like, is that how we needed to get that information dump? Is that the only way that you thought you could keep our attention? And if you thought that that's how you could keep our attention, who do you think is in your audience? Because I gotta tell you, as attractive as she is, it did very little for me.
And even in the points presented by the chef was basically saying, how can I pass off this food to customers so I'm not stuck with it, and was saying how he could misrepresent the food he was selling.
And I have to say, and this may just be because I'm more of a people psychology person than a numbers person, but there were quite a few points of financial chicanery that I just simply don't understand still, having watched this film and being relatively up on the news of the whole thing. It's like, wait, I don't even understand what we're talking about anymore. Like, it's just gibberish, and we're exchanging money for gibberish, which I guess is actually a fairly good take on how everything went down in 2007 and 2008. But I feel like at the end of this film, I was hoping to feel a little more secure in my understanding of what happened. And I think the film makes that promise. Like, at the end of this, you're going to understand a little bit more. And I don't know how much more I understand about the global banking crisis. How about you?
I understood a lot of the concepts they were explaining. I had not previously understood how they related to the crisis, but once they explained in possibly too much detail for many people, what exactly was going on. It made perfect sense in terms of the logistics. It doesn't make perfect sense from the standpoint of any rational person doing it, but it made sense why everything collapsed.
I just want to make a pause here and say, we do select up movies. It's just we seem to have stumbled upon a series of down movies, so thank you for sticking with us through all of this. I was thinking about the Steve Carell character, Mark Baum, who is introduced to us right at the beginning of the film as having gone through a terrible personal tragedy. And we don't learn all of it at once. There's sort of dribs and drabs of it, but there's certainly a point at which it becomes obvious to me as a viewer that his inability to stop the tragedy that was befalling his family is very similar to the way in which he's unable to stop the tragedy that's about to befall the world banking system. And they both are in part because he's been sort of irreparably tainted by the soup in which he's been dwelling. You know, that there's this idea of like his complicity with the banking system has ruined him as a human being. And I think that certainly, you get that from the Christian Bale, the Michael Burry character as well. It's played by Christian Bale. And the Brad Pitt character also has this idea of like, contact with this industry will destroy you as a human being.
Something I meant to mention earlier, and you talking about the various characters made me remember it. The transitions between focusing on one character and another were done extremely well. None of it felt jarring. There were a couple of cases where, and I'm sure it didn't happen in real life, but the characters would pass each other and you would stop following the one and start following the other one.
Yeah, there was a real skillful way in which you knew when to pick up. You know, everybody's yelling in one conference room on one coast, and then everybody's yelling in another conference room on another coast. And they're actually, you know, I just want to say, if you're not okay with really strong language or with a lot of people yelling or a lot of men yelling, this may not be the film for you. You know, there's another podcast I like to listen to called The West Wing Weekly, and they talk about how, in some ways, rewatching that old footage makes them have what they call Trump I moments, which is where something from the past, a piece of media from the past, makes them, you know, ache or be hurt as they think about what's happening right now. I certainly had some of that myself. At one point they talk about how, you know, at the end of the banking crisis that that who gets blamed but the poor and the immigrant. And in this case, the poor, the immigrant, and the teacher. And is like, oh, boy, that lands right kind of where we are right now. So that was sort of, there's a way in which this movie feels very prescient, even though it's only from 2015. There was just, I don't know that people in 2015 could have predicted where we are today, but yeah.
I thought the same thing. I had a note written down while I was watching it that there were a number of statements that felt very prophetic about our current political climate, even though this movie happened 2 years, you know, prior to it. And 1 year before the elections, even. Also, there seemed to be a couple of warnings for the future, if we're not careful again, how the markets are going to play out.
And at one point, one of the characters sort of says that we are living in an era of fraud in America. And he goes on to say it's not just banking, it's everything. And I think there's something hard. I don't know that the bankers would say those words. Maybe he did. Maybe I'm not giving him enough credit. But there was certainly something that rang true in that moment for me.
And one of the characters points out that fraud's been going on for centuries or even millennia. It's just now it has the ability to affect things on a much larger scale than it used to. And
it never succeeds for long, I think, is the other. So if we're going to take some uplift from this and some levity from it, it's to know that it doesn't succeed forever. Did you find this has been billed as a comedy of sorts? It's been billed as a funny movie. Did you find it funny, a comedy, or?
I would have classified it as a drama. There were definitely places where I laughed. Sometimes laughed very, very much to the point where I couldn't even hear a line of dialogue. But yeah, for the most part, it was a drama. There was some dry comedy throughout it as well, and definitely dark comedy. But it's not a movie I would actually term as a humorous movie. I didn't know what to expect going into it. I normally like these type of documentaries where they've made it more of a, documentaries where they've made it more of a relatable historical movie rather than sticking entirely to the facts. But I didn't know actually how this movie was going to play out. As you said, it was billed as a comedy, so I thought it wasn't really going to stick to what happened at all and just veer off dramatically at the beginning. And I was really impressed that they did provide information. So that's how we felt about this movie. If you would like to leave comments either on our site at novetovideo.com or on this YouTube video down below, we'll read them all and we'll try to respond to as many as possible.
All right. So on this episode, we're going to introduce something new that we're calling the Override Recommendation, sort of riffing on our veto theme, in which we're each going to take a moment and recommend another movie that you might want to check out, sort of based on our responses to this film. So what's your override recommendation?
I would definitely recommend Moneyball if you like this movie. It feels very similar. The only thing that's different is the setting. It's in the world of baseball instead, and no one lost their jobs or homes over it.
So it also stars Brad Pitt, and it also sort of takes a kind of esoteric look at something that can be controlled by math. So there you go. That's a good recommendation. My recommendation, let's see, riffing on the idea of real-world themes and strong language, I'm going to recommend the movie Spotlight, about the Boston Globe investigative journalism team, which I think is still available on Netflix if you want to check that out.
I believe it is.
All right.
Next week on No Veto Video, I'll be showing Catherine the movie Bad Medicine from the mid-'80s, starring Steve Guttenberg and Alan Arkin. It's a comedy. I'm breaking away from the horror movies I've been showing her.
So thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time as I get to watch Bad Medicine, and we'll all respond to it together. Thank you for being with us. If you want to, and we would ask you to, please hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll be up to date whenever we do send out new videos. So thank you. Bye.
Bye.